I thought the locked ranch gate would be the end of it. Instead, it was only the beginning. Every morning, fresh tire tracks cut through my land like a deliberate insult. The gate forced open again. The rules ignored again. The HOA called it a minor access issue. To me, it felt like a warning that someone nearby believed my property wasn't really mine. When polite complaints turned into fines and threats, I realized this wasn't about convenience anymore, it was about control. So I made a decision that changed everything. What happens when entitlement meets immovable steel? Before any of this happened, my life on the ranch was quiet, in the way people dream about when they say they want to escape the city. The land sat just outside a planned community, technically neighboring it but never truly part of it. I bought it for that exact reason. Wide open space, a long gravel drive, a simple gate at the property line, and the comforting sense that whatever happened beyond that fence wasn't my problem. My days followed a steady rhythm: maintenance in the mornings, long afternoons work in the land, evenings watching the sun drop behind the hills with nothing but wind and insects for company. The gate had always been there, long before I arrived. It wasn't decorative or fancy. It existed for one purpose: to mark a boundary and keep vehicles from cutting through the property. The previous owner had installed it after years of trespassing from nearby residents who treated the ranch like a shortcut. When I bought the place, I kept it locked and well marked, assuming that would be enough. Most people respected it. Some slowed down when they approached, clearly unsure if they were even supposed to be there. That's how boundaries are supposed to work. The neighboring HOA development, on the other hand, operated on a very different philosophy. Perfect lawns, matching mailboxes, strict rules about paint, colors, and parking. I barely noticed them at first. They were just houses in the distance, lined up neatly behind a decorative stone entrance and a sign promising order and harmony. I wasn't a member, didn't attend meetings, didn't pay dues, and didn't want anything to do with it. From my perspective, our coexistence was simple. I minded my land, they minded theirs. At least, that's what I thought. The first sign of trouble wasn't dramatic. It was subtle enough to almost dismiss. A set of tire tracks where there hadn't been any the night before. The gate still closed, still locked, but scuffed in a way that suggested someone had tested it. I chalked it up to curiosity or confusion. People get lost. People make mistakes. Rural properties can be unclear if you're not paying attention. Then it happened again, and again. The tracks became more deliberate, cutting deeper into the gravel, veering just enough to show intent. The gate started showing wear in places it never had before. Hinges strained, the latch scraped, nothing broken yet, but it was obvious someone wasn't treating it like a boundary. It felt less like an accident and more like a challenge. Still, I stayed calm. I reinforced the signage. Private property. No access. No through road. Clear enough for anyone who bothered to read. Life on the ranch continued, but the sense of peace began to thin. I started noticing cars slowing near the gate, drivers peering through as if evaluating something that didn't belong to them. Some would turn around. One didn't. That was the moment everything shifted. The gate was forced open just enough for a vehicle to pass, not destroyed, just bent enough to send a message. Someone had decided their convenience mattered more than my land. Shortly after that, the HOA entered the picture in a way that felt both absurd and unsettling. I received a formal notice referencing access concerns and community circulation issues. The language was polite, almost cheerful, but the implication was clear. They had opinions about my gate, opinions about how my property affected their residents. It was strange being told by an organization I didn't belong to that my land was somehow part of their problem. At that point, it still seemed manageable. A misunderstanding, maybe? A few overconfident residents who thought the rules extended farther than they actually did. I assumed common sense would prevail once boundaries were clarified. I had no idea that this was only the surface of something far more personal, far more petty, and far more aggressive than I ever expected. Because somewhere between those tire tracks and that first notice, someone in that neighborhood decided my ranch wasn't just inconvenient. It was an obstacle that needed to be dealt with. And once that mindset took hold, the quiet life I'd built began to unravel in ways I couldn't ignore anymore. Once the HOA decided my gate was their problem, everything began accelerating in a way that felt deliberate. What had started as unexplained tire tracks turned into a pattern of intrusion that no longer tried to hide itself. Vehicles cut through the ranch during peak commute hours, carving a visible path across land that had never been a road. The gate was no longer just tested. It was pushed, bent, and left ajar like an accusation. Each time I repaired it, the damage returned faster, as if someone was keeping score. The notices followed. Not from county officials or law enforcement, but from the HOA itself. Each letter carried the same polished tone, carefully worded to sound cooperative while quietly asserting authority they didn't have. They referenced safety concerns, emergency access, traffic flow, and community welfare. And I've appeared alongside phrases like non-compliance and obstruction, language chosen to make my refusal feel unreasonable. The message was clear even without threats. They expected the gate gone or permanently open. I responded the only way that made sense. I documented everything. Photos of the damage, dates, times, vehicle tracks. I've pulled property records, surveys, and easements. There was no ambiguity, no shared access, no right-of-way, no obligation to accommodate anyone's shortcut. On paper, the situation was straightforward. In reality, the pressure intensified the moment they realized I wasn't backing down. The fines came next. Small at first, almost insulting. Issued under obscure HOA bylaws about neighborhood connectivity and infrastructure interference. The absurdity would have been laughable if it hadn't been so persistent. I wasn't a member. I didn't vote. I didn't benefit from their amenities. Yet they sent invoices as if repetition alone could rewrite reality. Ignoring them didn't make them stop. It only seemed to provoke more creativity. The harassment became personal without ever becoming overt. Vehicles idled near the gate for longer than necessary. Footprints appeared where no one had reason to walk. Survey flags were moved. Boundary markers shifted just enough to make me question my memory. It was subtle, but constant. The kind of pressure that wears down resolve by making everything feel slightly unstable. The ranch no longer felt isolated in a peaceful way. It felt watched. The HOA escalated by involving the county, filing complaints framed as concerns about emergency vehicle access. Inspectors arrived, polite but cautious, walking the property with clipboards while I explained the situation for the third time. Each visit ended the same way. No violations. No orders. No requirement to open the gate. And yet, every inspection seemed to embolden the HOA rather than discourage them. They treated each non-result not as a loss, but as a delay. Meanwhile, the damage increased. One morning I found the gate twisted far enough that it wouldn't close at all. The hinges were strained beyond repair. Metal scraped raw where force had been applied repeatedly. It wasn't vandalism in the dramatic sense. It was wear inflicted intentionally, the slow destruction of something through persistence rather than violence. Replacing it wasn't cheap, but leaving it broken wasn't an option. An open gate was an invitation, and they already felt entitled. I upgraded the gate, heavier materials, reinforced posts, stronger locks. It held for a while, long enough for me to think the message had landed. Then the tracks returned, deeper than before. Someone had driven up to the gate, tested it, and turned around. Not because they respected it, but because they were measuring it. That realization settled in heavily. This wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. It was a contest. The HOAS letters grew sharper. References to legal action appeared, still wrapped in polite phrasing, but unmistakable. They cited attorneys. They implied costs. They suggested that cooperation would be cheaper than resistance. The underlying assumption never changed. They believed persistence would exhaust me, that eventually, I would decide it wasn't worth the trouble and give them what they wanted. What they didn't understand was that the ranch wasn't just land to me. It represented a line I'd drawn deliberately when I bought it. A refusal to live under someone else's arbitrary authority. Every repair, every document, every reinforced bolt strengthened my resolve rather than weakening it. If anything, the unfairness of it all clarified what was at stake. The turning point came when they tried to formalize their claim. A letter arrived outlining a proposed access agreement, drafted as if it were already inevitable. They described a shared use path, maintenance expectations, and conditions that would effectively convert part of my property into a community road. The language assumed consent that had never been given. It framed the change as mutually beneficial, ignoring the obvious reality that I would bear all the costs and risks. That was when the anger fully replaced confusion. This wasn't about emergency access. It wasn't about safety. It was about convenience and control. Someone in that HOA had decided their planned community should dictate the use of land beyond its borders, and they were willing to pressure, intimidate, and manipulate to make it happen. I sought legal advice, not because I doubted my position, but because I wanted certainty. The answer was unequivocal. The HOA had no standing, no easement, no authority. If anything, their continued interference bordered on harassment. Knowing that didn't make the situation easier. It made it clearer how far they were willing to go without consequences. The interference reached a new level when construction equipment appeared near the boundary on the HOA side. Grading, measuring, stakes placed suspiciously close to my fence line. It was presented as routine maintenance, but the intent was obvious. They were preparing infrastructure as if access were already secured, creating momentum that would make resistance seem unreasonable. Standing in the dirt, watching that preparation unfold, I realized they were trying to make my gate irrelevant by surrounding it with inevitability. I reinforced the gate again, but this time the solution felt temporary. No matter how strong the hardware, as long as a vehicle could approach it, the temptation remained. Each repair invited another test. Each test escalated the stakes. The ranch had become a battleground defined by inches of steel and stubborn will. The stress began to seep into daily life. The sleep came lighter, every unfamiliar sound carried weight. The quiet I had once valued now amplified anxiety. I found myself scanning the land for changes, new tracks, new damage, new signs of interference. It was exhausting in a way that felt intentionally engineered. The HOA didn't need to win outright. They only needed to make resistance unbearable. Then came the incident that removed any lingering doubt about their intentions. I arrived at the gate one afternoon to find it surrounded by traffic cones and temporary signage placed on my side of the property. Not official, not permitted, just enough to suggest legitimacy to anyone approaching. It was a psychological move, an attempt to normalize trespass through implication. That was the moment I understood they were no longer pretending to respect boundaries at all. I removed everything and documented it. Again, and as I stood there, looking at the scarred ground and bent metal, a different kind of clarity set in. If I kept reacting, I would always be one step behind. Reinforcing the gate wasn't enough. Repairing damage wasn't enough. Arguing legality wasn't enough. As long as access remained physically possible, they would keep pushing. The realization didn't come with relief. It came with a decision that carried weight. One that would be expensive, visible, and impossible to ignore. Something that wouldn't just say no, but make no the only option left. And once that idea took hold, there was no going back. The decision didn't feel dramatic at first. It felt heavy, like setting something down that had been carried too long. I stopped reacting and started planning, quietly and deliberately, while the HOA continued operating under the assumption that pressure would eventually break me. They didn't know that their persistence had finally forced clarity. If access was the weapon they kept using, then access itself had to disappear. Permits came first. Not because I needed permission to protect my own land, but because I wanted nothing left for them to exploit. Every form was filed correctly. Every boundary was confirmed again. Survey stakes were rechecked down to inches. County officials reviewed the plans, nodded, and signed off without hesitation. No easement meant no accommodation. The law was clean. The land was mine. And what I was about to do was unambiguous. The HOA sensed something shifting. Their letters became erratic, alternating between urgency and false friendliness. They've referenced upcoming meetings, hinted at collective action, and warned about long-term consequences. It was pressure disguised as concern, but it came too late. For the first time since this began, I wasn't bracing for their next move. I was preparing my own. The morning the installation began, the ranch felt different. Not tense, not anxious, but focused. Heavy equipment rolled in slowly, deliberately, stopping exactly where the old gate line had been tested and abused for months. The damaged gate was removed entirely, leaving behind open ground scarred by tire tracks and bent metal. For anyone watching from a distance, it probably looked like the HOA had finally won. Then, the drilling started. Deep, precise holes were bored into the earth, spaced evenly across the former access point. Steel bollards followed thick, immovable cylinders designed to stop vehicles, not suggest boundaries. They were industrial, unmistakable, and permanent in a way a gate never could be. As each one was lowered into place and anchored into concrete, the message became impossible to misinterpret. This wasn't a request. It wasn't a negotiation. It was a line being drawn in steel. That was when the attention arrived. Vehicles slowed on the road bordering the property. Some stopped. Others turned around abruptly. A few lingered just long enough to understand what had changed. The HOA representatives arrived shortly after, not with authority, but with outrage. They hovered at the edge of the property, unable to cross, unable to pretend this was temporary. The access they'd treated as inevitable was gone, replaced by something that couldn't be pushed, bent, or quietly forced open. The letters escalated into threats almost immediately. Legal action was no longer implied. It was promised. They accused me of disrupting the community, of acting in bad faith, of deliberately harming property values. The language was sharper than ever, but it rang hollow now. They weren't speaking from power anymore. They were reacting to its sudden absence. Their attorneys reached out next. Formal and direct, demanding removal of the barriers and immediate discussions about shared access. The confidence they tried to project collapsed under scrutiny. What? Property records were presented again, when surveys were attached. When the lack of easement was restated without emotion, the demands sought. Deadlines became suggestions, threats became requests. For the first time, the tone shifted away from certainty. The real shock came when the HOA attempted one final maneuver. They organized a site visit, inviting county officials under the guise of safety review, hoping external pressure might succeed where internal force had failed. It was their last play, and it unfolded publicly. Inspectors arrived, walked the boundary, reviewed the permits, examined the bollards, and confirmed what had already been established. There was no violation. No obstruction of any legal right. No grounds for action. Watching that conclusion settle over the group felt surreal. The same HOA representatives who had spoken so confidently for months stood confronted by their own overreach. The illusion of authority evaporated in real time, replaced by something closer to embarrassment. This wasn't a quiet loss they could reframe later. It happened in full view of the systems they'd tried to manipulate. The aftermath was immediate. HOA communications stopped abruptly. No more notices, no more invoices, no more veiled warnings. The access agreement proposal vanished without explanation. Construction activity near the boundary halted, equipment removed as quickly as it had appeared. The momentum they'd tried to manufacture collapsed under the weight of undeniable reality. The ranch grew quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet than before. The silence didn't feel fragile, it felt earned. The steel bollards stood where the gate once had, casting long shadows across ground that had been treated like a shortcut for far too long. Tire tracks stopped appearing, vehicles stopped slowing. The boundary was no longer something to test, it was something to accept. Emotion crept in slowly after that, not triumph in the dramatic sense, but vindication mixed with exhaustion. The months of pressure, the constant vigilance, the feeling of being encroached upon by people who believed rules existed only when convenient it all finally released its grip. Standing there, looking at the barrier that ended it, I understood something that hadn't been clear before. This wasn't just about property. It was about refusing to be worn down by entitlement masquerading as authority. The HOA never apologized. They never acknowledged wrongdoing. They didn't need to. Their silence said everything. Power built on assumption collapses the moment it's challenged with permanence. They had relied on hesitation, on compromise, on the idea that pushing long enough would guarantee compliance. Steel doesn't hesitate. It doesn't compromise. It simply stands. And as the sun dropped behind the hills that evening, casting the ranch in familiar light, one thing became unmistakably clear. The conflict wasn't over because someone finally listened. It was over because there was nothing left to argue with. The weeks after the installation passed without incident, and that alone felt surreal. For months, the ranch had been a place of constant vigilance, where every new day carried the expectation of interference. Now the silence wasn't tense, or temporary. It settled in slowly, the kind that proves itself by lasting. No fresh tire tracks appeared. No vehicles slowed near the boundary. No letters arrived wrapped in false concern or legal language. The conflict didn't fade, it stopped. Steel bollards changed more than accessed. They changed behavior. But the gate never fully communicated, the barrier made undeniable. There was no longer a suggestion of negotiation, no visual ambiguity, no sense that persistence might eventually wear something down. The land was no longer something to test. It was defined, finished, and final. People adapt quickly when resistance becomes impossible. Life on the ranch began to return to its original rhythm, but it carried a new layer of awareness. The quiet felt deeper now, not because nothing happened, but because something had been resolved decisively. The stress that once lingered in the background dissolved gradually. Sleep came easier. The habit of scanning for disturbances faded. I could work the land without feeling like I was defending it at the same time. But that shift alone made the entire ordeal feel worthwhile. The HOA, meanwhile, retreated into itself. Their communications resumed as if nothing had ever happened, focused inward on paint colors, parking violations, and landscaping. My name never appeared again. The boundary was no longer mentioned in meetings. The shortcut that had once been treated as a community entitlement disappeared from casual conversation. It was as if acknowledging the failure would give it power, so they pretended it had never existed. But consequences don't require an acknowledgement to take effect. Word spread quietly through the neighboring area, not as gossip, but as a lesson. People who once assumed the ranch was a convenient bypass adjusted their routes without complaint. New residents learned the boundary without ever testing it. The absence of conflict became its own message. When something is truly settled, it doesn't need defending. It simply becomes part of reality. The county never contacted me again. No follow-up inspections. No additional reviews. The permits remained on file. The documentation complete. From a legal perspective, the situation was closed. From a practical one, it had never been more open and honest. The land was mine, and now it was treated that way without question. The impact reached beyond the physical property. It changed how I viewed authority, especially the kind that presents itself as benevolent while exerting pressure behind closed doors. The HOA hadn't acted out of malice in the traditional sense. They acted out of certainty that their rules mattered more than boundaries. That persistence equaled entitlement, and that resistance was merely a phase. Challenging that certainty exposed how fragile it really was. What struck me most was how quickly the power dynamic collapsed once it was confronted with something non-negotiable. Months of letters, threats, and interference unraveled the moment access was removed entirely. There was no grand apology or public reckoning, just quiet withdrawal. It reinforced a truth that feels uncomfortable but undeniable. Systems built on assumption only function as long as no one forces them to justify themselves. The ranch benefited in ways I hadn't anticipated. Without traffic cutting through, the land began to heal. Gravel settled. Grass returned. The sense of intrusion that had altered the atmosphere vanished. Even the animals seemed calmer, less wary of sudden movement. The environment responded to the absence of disruption, the same way people do by settling into what feels right. Emotionally, the experience left a mark, but not a bitter one. It clarified something fundamental about boundaries. They aren't about hostility or exclusion. They're about responsibility. When boundaries are vague, the most assertive voices tend to dominate. When they're clear, everyone adjusts accordingly. The conflict hadn't arisen because I was unreasonable. It arose because ambiguity invited entitlement. There were moments, in hindsight, where compromise might have seemed easier. Leaving the gate unlocked, allowing limited access, accepting inconvenience in exchange for peace. But peace built on surrender isn't peace at all. It's temporary quiet purchased at the cost of autonomy. The steel bollards didn't just protect land. They protected the principle that ownership means something tangible, not theoretical. Looking back, the most exhausting part wasn't the damage or the paperwork. It was the slow erosion of certainty that comes from being told, repeatedly, that standing your ground is selfish, that resisting collective convenience is somehow antisocial. The HOA framed their demands as reasonable, even generous, while shifting all burden onto someone outside their system. Recognizing that tactic for what it was changed everything. The experience also revealed how rare true accountability can be. In small power structures, when authority goes unchecked, it grows comfortable. When challenged, it often retreats without reflection. That silence afterward isn't resolution through understanding. It's resolution through limitation. And sometimes, that's enough. The ranch remains exactly what it was meant to be, a place defined by intention rather than convenience. The boundary is no longer symbolic. It's structural. The steel stands not as a monument to conflict, but as a reminder that clarity ends disputes faster than compromise ever could. People occasionally ask about the bollards, curious about their permanence. I don't explain the entire story. I don't need to. The barrier speaks for itself. It tells anyone who approaches that some lines exist not to be crossed, not because they're guarded aggressively, but because they're respected once made unmistakable. Lasting impact isn't visible from the road. It's internal. A reinforced understanding that standing firm doesn't require aggression, only resolve. That authority without legitimacy collapses under scrutiny. And that sometimes, the most powerful response isn't louder arguments or longer explanations, it's action that leaves no room for debate. In the end, the HOA didn't lose because I fought harder. They lost because they underestimated the power of finality. They believed every obstacle could be negotiated away. They were wrong. And as the land rests now, quiet and uninterrupted, the lesson lingers long after the conflict faded. When someone insists your boundaries are inconvenient, the real question isn't how much you're willing to give up to keep the peace. It's how much peace is worth if it isn't actually yours.